Today we're at the table with Dr. Candy Hill and Kathy Walters, and we're doing a series, or actually it's not a series; it's a standalone message at our church about stress and anxiety. And we were sitting around in the office, and we were like, you know what? We don't really know what we're talking about, and we need to bring in a professional. And you know what? We called Dr. Candy Hill, and she said, "I would love to." So I want you to take it just a second and just tell us a little bit about you and what brought you into your profession and all of that.
Okay. So I am a perpetual nerd. I loved school when I was younger, and that is apparent because I started my college at ULM and I got 2 degrees there because one was not sufficient. So I got my bachelor's and then I got my first master's degree there. And then I followed this professor who I adored over to Louisiana Tech, and I got my second master's degree and my doctorate from there. And because what's one more, I went back to school one more time and got what's called a postdoctoral master's in clinical psychopharmacology, which allows me to prescribe. All of this started because when I was younger, my mother had some mental health issues, and she had substantial difficulty getting the treatment that she needed or for someone to identify what had happened. So in middle school, I actually read a book, and the things that I read, they resonated with me. I was like, Mom, I think that this is what's going on. And I took it to her, and turns out she had that thing. But it took somebody reading to get her the services that she needed. So my heart was always for those people who suffered with mental health things, and for ensuring that they got the need that their needs met. And so there I went into all of the psychology, and here I am.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I can completely relate with you. I'm also that person that has a lot of different degrees. I'm always making jokes about the fact, well, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I got this degree, and then I got this, and I kept going. But that's awesome. So one of the things that I know, just because I've talked to you at different times, and I know you through friends and things, you are a believer, and I believe that as a Christian, as a believer in any profession, that makes an impact. And so in light of the fact that we're talking about stress and anxiety, how does that impact you in your profession?
So in psychology, Christianity, particularly when you're looking at evangelical Christianity, is not looked very favorably upon. Yes. So most of the people that I've met, they have been atheist or agnostic or really searching and not sure what they believed. So in those courses, as you're confronting people who have beliefs that are in direct contradiction to what you believe, it requires that you really dig in and get to know what you believe. Right. So I think that my Christianity has actually deepened my understanding of psychology, because I have something that a lot of people don't. When I think about the different theories that we use to treat anxiety and depression, I recognize their biblical roots as biblical roots, whereas a lot of other people believe that this is something that some man created. And yes, the man wrote the theory, and the theory grew, and he should have some credit for that. But realistically, it started in the Bible, and God said it first.
Wow, that's really neat. I'll be honest, which I was talking to you a little bit before we got started. I come from the background of not having real understanding. You know, I had told you I've never had an anxiety attack or a panic attack or anything like that. So even as I've at different places that I've worked and I've made friends, and I have come to understand it more through just my interactions with them. And at times I still don't understand a lot of the reactions they have or the responses they have or the things that they do. And so I've never really thought about it from that perspective, that the roots are biblical, you know. So what if you I would love to hear more about that. Like, what does that look like? I mean, when I hear you say that the roots are biblical, can you expound on that part of that a little bit more?
So there is one theory, and it's probably my favorite theory of psychology. It's cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is that you take your thought and recognize when it gets distorted or twisted, and then you adjust it and make it line up with reality a little bit better. Well, that theory lines up perfectly with scriptural thought that you have to capture your thoughts and that you have to give your thoughts to God and let Him purify them and make them holy. But the cognitive behavioral theorists believe that cognitive behavioral therapy is just something based in humanity and in what humans created. But again, God said it first.
Wow.
He said, capture your thoughts.
Yeah.
The tricky part is knowing how to do that.
Wow. I have a friend. I was actually just telling this story the other day. I have a friend, and she does have a lot of anxiety and triggers panic attacks. And we kind of talk about it just because I want to understand more. I want to, if I see that, I want to fully understand what's going on. And one day we were driving down the road, and there was a tree that was leaning over, and we drove under it, and she said something like, I just almost, had a panic attack. And I said, what are you talking about? Yeah. And she said, I had this thought of that tree could fall and hit the car and I might die. And then I have to call my husband and then he'll have to tell the kids that. And I told her, I said, that's funny because I actually had the same thought. Like, not to that extent.
Yes.
I'm driving. I think, that tree could fall and hit my car and I could die. But then I kept driving, and then it was gone. I never once, thought about that again. And I thought, that's crazy, because we both had the same initial thought. So what is that? And this may be a question that I don't even know if it can be answered. What makes the difference? Is there something with some people's brains or personalities that some do that and some don't? What is that?
I wish there was a simple answer to that. I don't think
there was no simple answer.
I don't think that we really know precisely what it is. We do know, though, that anxiety is, and I think people who are like purists would probably argue with me on this point, but in some ways, anxiety is contagious. And what I mean by that is if I grow up with a parent who is tremendously anxious about their world, then what they're going to do is teach me that the world is scary. And so I'm going to then model that. And I'm going to assume that whenever I go into this place that something bad might happen. So I'm going to be more likely to take that and carry it and take it to places that are really negative. On the other hand, if you grow up with a parent that's like, oh, you'll be fine, then you learn that you'll be fine. And there are extremes of both of those things. So I think at least a part of it is environmental. Now, I do think there's a genetic component to that some of us are born with some tendency toward that, which I know we think of ourselves as born in the image of God, but we live in a broken world, which means that there is brokenness within us. And in the same way that Paul talked about the thorn in his side, that we really don't know what that was, I think for some of us, it's mental health things. It's that our thoughts are hard to capture. And so some of us have it, and some of us don't. And some of us, it's just so minimal that it doesn't really register for us. So it's not something that we, kind of like you, like, oh, well, yeah, that's kind of scary, but it's fine. Yeah. And then others of us.
You'll be okay.
Yes.
You'll be okay.
But then the anxious person goes, oh my goodness, that tree's going to fall. And then they think, well, if the tree falls, then it's going to fall on my car. And if it falls on the car, there's going to be a wreck. And if there's a wreck, then we're all going to die. And if I die, then my kids are going to do this. And then my kids are going to be without any parent. And then they're going to go to jail. And then they're going to die. And everyone's going to live in a box under the bridge.
Yes.
And we go to all of these really terrible places. And ultimately, it's just a matter of what we do with the thought when we have it. Do we entertain it? Do we allow it to grow? Or do we recognize what it is and then move on?
Wow, that's good. That's good. So something that we've talked about as we've prepared for this message, and we've talked about different parts of it, is that it seems like, this may not be an accurate statement, but it seems like anxiety is everywhere we turn. That it's more prevalent. Even when I think about, I have two sets of kids. I talk about my two sets. I've got older ones that are married, and I've got younger ones. Even in raising them, my first set, I never heard them come home and say, I'm anxious about something or nervous, whereas now I hear that more so. Is it more prevalent, and why? Why is that?
I think that's, again, not a simple answer.
Yeah. Sorry,
Nothing is simple.
Like asking hard questions. No.
Well, when you talk about mental health, though, we're always dealing in gray area. We're never dealing in black or white. We're always dealing with that in between, where the answer is always it depends. And for this particularly, I think to some degree it is more prevalent post-COVID. Post-COVID, we saw a tremendous increase in the amount of anxiety that people were experiencing.
Right.
But they were isolated, they were alone, our churches were closed, our sources of support were gone, all of which increased the likelihood that you're going to be anxious or scared or worried or alone. So mental health things rise. And in that sense, I think it is more prevalent. The other thing that I think is happening is that there's so much more availability of that sort of language. So think about when you open up your reels, what do you see?
Yes.
You see all of these things about being anxious and what the anxious mind does, and the mom who does this or that to cope with the anxiety. You see things about neurodivergence and neurotypicality.
Yeah.
Like the language of mental health is everywhere. So how would our children and our younger people not use that language more?
Right.
They're inundated with it in every part of their lives.
So even in the use of that language, are they really experiencing it, or is it just the language is more common?
I think it's a combination of those two things. I think if I think about my upbringing compared to my children's, so if I had a rough day at school because someone was mean to me, I could go home and seek refuge. Like that person had no access to me. I didn't have a cell phone. I had a beeper, but the beeper would sometimes go off and sometimes not. And you only use cell phones from like 9 p.m. until whatever to avoid charges. Well, my kids have constant access to their world. So when they leave school, that bad day follows them eternally. Like there is no break from that. So I think in that way it's continual and they're experiencing anxiety. But then I think they also are sometimes using really like clinical words to describe something that we would have thought of as normal. And it just doesn't feel normal because they've got a language to ascribe to it. So it's a combination of those things.
So for a parent, like if you were trying to talk to a parent where a child maybe is using that kind of language, what are there signs or symptoms, or outside of clearly a panic attack, if there's where you can actually see the effects, what are some of the maybe subtle beginning signs that could be happening to your child, or that they might be experiencing that extreme, that state of being in anxiety,
where it's more disordered.
Right.
I think whenever you start thinking about mental health disorders, you want to look for disruptions to function. That's what you're looking for. So are they withdrawing? Are they suddenly, like when you look at them, they look like they are so tightly wound that they can't relax. Their shoulders start creeping up to their ears, or they're suddenly quieter, or even like they're really chatty, but they're edgy. And there's always an edge to their voice. It's not always puberty. Sometimes the edginess is that they're anxious, and so it's coming out in this irritability that doesn't go away, or their eating habits change. Once you start seeing that they're withdrawing, their eating habits have changed, they're getting more tense, those are good signs that something is real and it's sustained. So when it's just them using the language, then it's probably going to look like, I was so anxious at school today because Miss So-and-so did whatever, and then 10 minutes later, they're going to be fine.
Yes, I'm familiar with those statements right there.
I hear those statements all the time. I was so anxious. And then whenever we really talk, like it wasn't anxiety. It was a bad minute where the teacher like upset them, or, something didn't go their way. So there is definitely a distinct difference there.
And in that moment, that would be a perfect opportunity for the parent just to sit and have those conversations. Right?
Absolutely.
To see if there's an reason that
there's something going on. Yeah. And that's a good time to talk with them too about how God made emotions and how there aren't any emotions that are wrong or bad, but we should all feel happy and we should all feel sad and we should all worry sometimes. Like there are things that we should be concerned about. What we shouldn't do is get stuck in any one, because the joy of the Lord should come from you at all times. So if the joy of the Lord is emanating from you, it doesn't mean you're happy all the time.
Right.
But then you don't get stuck in this deep despair or this paralyzing fear. That's not the joy of the Lord.
Right. So these same things that you said, are those the symptoms that an adult would see in themselves? And that's something, I guess, because I think I had one moment, and I actually came back after a trip and told my friend, I think I felt it. I think I know what you're talking about all the time when you say, I'm having an anxiety attack. But I had gone to a concert, and I was way up the very top. You know, we were way up there, and I got to the very top, and I've never even thought that I was afraid of heights, and I don't really think I am, but I got up there and sat down and looked down, and I thought for a second, oh, I can't breathe. You know, I can't. Oh, let me sit down. You know, I might fall, and then if I fall, I would. You know, and for a good probably 1 minute, I thought, oh. And then the concert started, and I was fine. And but in that moment, I felt like, oh, this is what my friend feels all the time. Like when she's struggling, and so I recognize it. I don't know if I would have recognized that had I not been exposed to my friend talking about it. And so, how is it recognized? I mean, do adults recognize it? And if not, I mean, what are those symptoms? How can you know that you potentially need to seek help, you know, and get a therapist or a counselor? Or
some adults notice, some adults don't. I noticed the older generation has a harder time accepting it because they were raised with this like need to push through and to tough through,
right?
And so they feel like going and getting help would be admitting that they don't have mental toughness that they were supposed to have. Other adults, just like the kids, they're getting the same reels that we are, and so they are aware of symptoms. And there are some good sources of information in social media. So I give it a bad rap, but it's not wholly bad.
Right.
But yeah, symptoms to look for. Some of those are the same as with kids. Like if you are irritable and edgy all the time and like your brain won't stop. It is constantly going. The thing I hear most often with thoughts is I'll ask them, okay, well, can you identify an anxious thought? No, there are a million of them. I can't stop them. I don't know. I'm worried about everything. That's a really good sign that you've got something going on. The other is a lot of times people will go and they'll seek medical help because their breathing has gotten really shallow and they feel like they can't get their breath and it's like there's an elephant sitting on their chest.
Right.
Or they'll have tremors. They'll have some level of dizziness even can come from that, stomach aches and headaches and feeling tired all the time. That's not always sickness. Sometimes it's anxiety. Usually those things go together when your heart is racing and you feel short of breath, but you're breathing.
Right.
So that's the time that people end up going to the ER because they're like, well, I feel like I can't catch my breath. But then they go in and they put the little O2 thing on their finger and it's fine.
Right.
Because they are breathing. It just feels really heavy. So you put those things together with the irritability, the edginess, the constant like tension. Most people who are anxious, they're going to wear their shoulders a little bit higher. They're going to feel tension all like here and shooting down their backs. And so they're going to have some pain associated with that. And that's a really good sign. You probably need to go see somebody.
Yeah. Wow. So you kind of, you mentioned this, a generation that wouldn't go, you know, to seek. And we actually had somebody when we were talking about this who said it was actually an act of humility. They had to humble themselves to seek help. And I thought, wow, I'd never really thought about that. Do you think that in the Christian community that there is a little bit of a stigma? And it may not even just be Christian community. It may, although I hear outside of church people talk about, oh, I have a therapist, and they no hesitation. But even, you know, it seems like there's a little hesitation. Do you feel like there is that stigma?
I do. Now we're in the deep South, and so you know everything trickles down. So I think there is still a stigma here that isn't as big if you go into bigger cities or maybe more north, or even in other countries. But within the church, there is this definite idea, a faulty idea, that if you go to therapy, then you're doing something wrong in your spiritual life, that you're not praying sufficiently, you're not in the Word enough, you're not faithful enough. And so a lot of times when Christians come in, they come in with this shame and this guilt and this heaviness of like, I'm not good enough for God, which just totally breaks my heart.
Right.
But it's perpetuated by people asking questions like, have you prayed? Did you read your Bible today?
Right.
And those are good things. Like we should definitely encourage our brothers and sisters in the Word. But sometimes we do need a little bit more than that. We need to read and to pray and also to seek godly counsel, which is biblical.
Right.
And we ignore that part sometimes.
Right. I think I could have benefited from, because I think I was insensitive at first, because I come from the perspective of I don't fully understand, because I haven't experienced it. So what would you say to that friend who has a friend? How do I be a better friend in that? Because I probably have been guilty of saying, well, let me just pray for you. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, how are you a good friend to someone who is dealing with that stress to the level of anxiety and.
I think some of it is doing one of the things that you've done. It's that perspective taking. So I had an experience similar to you. We went to watch the Pelicans last year with Coach Brown and the basketball team, and our seats were literally the top of the stadium. And I am afraid of heights, like 100%. But that heart racing, panicky, oh my goodness, I can't breathe. I had never had a panic attack. Right. But in that moment, I'm like, oh, kind of like you. That's what that feels like.
Right.
I think if we'll take those moments and we'll actually recognize and apply and use that perspective to ask, what would have been helpful for me in that moment? Right. It will help us to be a better friend. Or in those moments where I'm really feeling down or low, what would have been helpful for me? Would it have been helpful for someone to just hug me and say, you know what, I understand. I understand that you're really struggling. I don't understand your anxiety necessarily, but I understand struggle and I understand pain. Right. What can I do for you?
Yeah.
And just that presence a lot of times goes a really, really long way.
Absolutely. If you were speaking to a congregation or, or a group of people, what would you say? Because, I mean, obviously that's something that we think about a lot of times when you look at an entire congregation or if you're looking at like a large group of people. Everybody in that room, they're at different levels or they're at different situations. Some have never experienced anxiety. Some experience a great amount of anxiety. What is a best next step, if that makes sense? Like, what is your first... for the people who don't experience it, how can they be support? For the people who, have attacks regularly and deal with worry and fear and anxiety a lot, what is the first next step, if that makes sense? Does that question make sense?
I think so.
In my mind it did, but as I'm sitting here trying to explain that, I'm thinking, I don't even know if that really makes sense.
So I'll jump in and try, and then if I don't get it right, you just tell me and I'll fix it.
Okay.
So on the side of the person who doesn't really understand, ask your friend. Yeah. Ask them to explain to you what happens in their body, and then imagine that. Because most of us have had a time where our heart has raced, even if it was on a roller coaster or something. And so we can usually, if they explain to us, well, my heart is racing and I'm feeling like it's hard for me to breathe and my thoughts feel really busy. Well, most of us have done that. So that's a good first step. Ask them what their experience is in, and then put yourself in their position. Then you're in a better place to respond in a way that's going to be loving and supportive. And then, of course, if you notice they've got a real problem, maybe guide them toward some godly counsel or toward treatment.
Right.
If you're on the other spectrum of that and you're suffering with anxiety and you haven't sought help, your next step might be look for a counselor. There are so many resources available, and we are blessed to be in an area where there's so many Christian counselors that are really good that you should be able to find someone who clicks with you right away, or at least with a couple of calls.
Yes.
So that would be a really good step. There are also apps out there that are fantastic and really good places to start if you need a right now thing. So I like, and Matt will laugh at me when he hears this, but Smiling Mind is probably my favorite. It's a meditation app that doesn't do any... Sometimes when you do meditation things, there are some Middle Eastern ideas that creep in there that really bump up against what we believe. Smiling Mind doesn't do that. It's a free app, which is great. It is also organized by age and location.
Oh, wow.
So you can click and it will tell you kids, and you click it and it's got some meditations that are specifically for little kids.
Right.
And then work or school, and they've got meditation specific for that. That's a super easy way to start capturing your thoughts and not spend any money and hardly any time. The other is, we talked about the distorted thoughts earlier. There's one called Clarity, and there's a paid portion, there's a free version. It's a great app, and it's good for just identifying what you're thinking identifying that it's a problem, and then starting to think about things in a different way. So those would be two really helpful, practical apps to just download and look into.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that's great. So if you were just going to say something, whatever your parting words are for to help somebody, about stress and anxiety, if you would, that one thing that I didn't ask you the right question to get you there, that I didn't direct you in the right direction, that you would just say, this is something I think is important to share, what would you say?
I would say let go of your shame. Let go of your guilt. And instead, embrace that anxiety is one of the most frequently talked about things in the Bible because God knew that you were going to experience this. Like he already knew, and he was already there, and he was already present. So you don't have to feel guilt and shame about that. When you start this work, it's going to be incredibly difficult. It's not easy. It sounds easy. Capturing your thoughts, that sounds so simple, but it's so incredibly difficult. And then identify that your thoughts might be lying to you. They might not be born in truth. In fact, anxious thoughts are generally not. They're usually some exaggeration of something that could possibly happen and probably won't.
Yeah.
So identify those couple of things and then call and get some help.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Candy Hill, for coming and joining us and telling us all this information. It's a lot. It's good information, good resources, and I appreciate you because it matters and people matter. And whenever there is a problem that our fellow brothers and sisters are dealing with, whether we've never dealt with it, from my experience, it matters because they are, and we are a part of this family of God. And so thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. And
Great,
thank you for
thanks.
joining us today.